I'm not actually a native Norwegian. I relocated there some time ago. But the work that I'm going to talk to you is actually about some work that occurred in Sweden, part of which has been turned into a very long-running professional development project there. And one of the things about being in Scandinavia, which was such a relief, is one that you have children, you have something like between 90 and 95% of children from the ages of 1 actually attending kindergarten, preschool. It is generally funded by the government and everyone has a right to have their child there. It also means that it's a very play-orientated approach. So learning occurs through play. You have no testing of young children, although Norway is murmuring things. And there was a huge, in Norwegian it's uproar, and I always think of uproar. So, and a discussion about the minister's wish to actually do, in Norwegian it's called kartlegging, which is like mapping of young children, particularly on language, to determine those who need help and support. And it was actually defeated. They got, the teachers and the educators protested, and it was defeated as seen as actually something which was not in the best interests of children. It was better that the teachers worked with the children and that they didn't need to actually test the children. So it's a very particular environment in which early childhood is situated, and it has a very close relationship to Froebel and the Northern European approach. But both Sweden and Norway are slightly different, and I won't go into those differences now. But this work was conducted in Swedish preschool, and it was done as part of work. Oh, I was going to show you this. To locate myself. This was taken yesterday in Bergen. So I have left the sunshine and I came to the rain. And if I tell you that Bergen is the rainiest place in Europe, we get 3 meters of rain a year. So it is something particularly unique to get that sort of weather. But I just thought I would show you where I came from. One of the things that we've been investigating, and this is because both in Norway and in Sweden, the mathematical understandings which are connected to preschool, kindergarten, early childhood are based on Alan Bishop's 6 mathematical activities. And the reason why we have picked this up and looked at it is because it situates the learning of young children not in connection to school mathematics. So it doesn't look at it as a watered down version or a preparation for school. It looks at it in a very different way and says, what do these young children actually do in this regard? And the 6 mathematical activities are playing, explaining, measuring, designing, counting, and locating. So Maria and I had a discussion about the title for this paper, and I wanted to stay with the title that I had because locating has this meaning of we're discussing learning as being located in these divides between the social and the individual and between the mind and the body, but it is also what kind of learning is going on. It's the locating learning of young children, in this situation, of toddlers. Now, if I go too fast, we're a fairly small group, just ask me questions as we go along, okay? So, what do we mean by locating? During spatial orientating, humans use a multitude of information from several senses, including but not limited to vision, audition, the vestibular system. Now, I had to look this up, I have to admit. It's to do with your balance, so your inner ear, and when you feel, particularly I've just been on an aeroplane, when you feel that the world is not quite as stable as you would like it to be. And kinesthetics, your movements. So all these different sources inform human navigators about their movement in the outside world, as well as changes in position and orientation with respect to aspects of that environment. This information is further integrated and coordinated with action plans and the behaviour of other social agents. Now, one of the advantages of the Scandinavian languages is that when you talk about locating, you have two ways of doing it. And one of them indicates a static position. I'm standing on the floor behind the desk. We can do that easily in English. But what you can also do in the Scandinavian language is that you can indicate movement. I'm moving towards, I'm moving backwards from. And we have some possibilities to do it in English, but not as well pronounced as you have within the Scandinavian languages. So that action and movement is more incorporated into those languages than they are into English. And that has some implications, but we're not going to talk about it today. Just thought I'd mention it now. So in regards to learning, we've often had this debate about which theoretical perspective should we actually pick up and consider. And Piaget is the one that I learned about when I was doing my teacher education, and has had a huge influence, particularly on what is expected of young children and the sorts of stages that they should go through. The other person who talks very much about learning, which is very much recognised, is Vygotsky. And here you have someone who takes very much into mind the ideas that the social environment contributes to that learning. Both of these people refer back to Kant, to Immanuel Kant, who was a philosopher, and he talked very much about the importance of reasoning, autonomous reasoning. And in order to be a human being, you needed to be autonomous in your reasoning. And both Piaget and Vygotsky has a connection to that understanding. And that has an impact on how we view toddlers. Because how do you think of toddlers and autonomous reasoning? And that's what I'm going to spend the first bit of this talk talking about, is some of those relationships and what does it have in the way of meaning of how we conceptualise what very young children can do mathematically. So this is a translation from Kant, and it talks a bit about this body-mind divide. So no matter how well I may know the order of the compass points, I can only determine regions according to that order only insofar as I know towards which hand, my right hand or my left hand, this order proceeds. So what he's saying is that you cannot organise whether you know whether you're facing north or south or east or west unless you've actually orientated your body, and you do that by actually recognising which hands you have beside you in which direction. And I think that this is an important point. So for him, you can have a conceptualisation and a mental map of compass points, but actually you can't put that into operation unless you do it through your understanding of your body. And that's worth thinking about. Piaget, on the other hand, when he's talking about very young children, says sensory motor activity alone and unaided cannot extend beyond the field of direct perception. So how we take that information in through our eyes, through our ears, and through our understanding if we're stable or not. To extend space beyond the confines of that perceptual field is the task of the imagination. Sensory motor activity is reinforced by imagination at the point where the symbolic function first appears. And this understanding that this symbolic function has been really strong. We make distinctions on children about whether they can use language or can't use language, because language is one of these symbolic functions. That is to say, when the signifiers in the form of symbols or images or signs, words, begin to be differentiated from what they signify in the form of conceptual space. The real object of our studies may be said to begin. So from this perspective, toddlers who are still just learning words and language are not considered to be able to imagine. And that has this connection to autonomous reasoning. Because if you're not thinking, then you cannot be an autonomous reasoner. Vygotsky, this tie between perception and meaning can be seen in the process of children's speech development. You can say to the child clock and he starts looking for the clock. The word originally signifies a particular spatial location. So even for Vygotsky, this emphasis is on language, the use of language. So what I'm saying and what I'm going to say here is that they got it wrong. And the reason why is because the body is so important within making the connection between the individual and the social understandings. So is the cat going up or is it going down? The way you see that will be based on your previous experiences. Your previous experiences, particularly with cats, going up and down. But it is something that you view and you have to make sense of, and you have to some extent imagine what's happening here because you haven't got it directly in front of you. The other picture that I've got there is from the rabbit-proof fence. Now, in Scandinavia, I have to explain that movie. But the point of it is that those young children who were taken away from their families had to walk 1,000 or so kilometres to find their way home. They orientated themselves by having a mental map, a mental image, but they learned it within the social environment. And they then had to put that into practice. So the practice wasn't just a mental image. They had to make sense of it in their own heads and then actually put it into action and operate it. So although I'm talking about toddlers, and the toddlers allow me to question Piaget and to question Vygotsky, actually some of those questions are relevant and for adults as well. It's just that it's easier to see it with toddlers because once you start looking at what toddlers do, suddenly some of these things we have assumed were normal are not normal any longer. Biester has written a lot about education, and he said with Kant, rational autonomy became the marker of humanity, which left those who were considered to be not or not yet rational, including children, in a difficult position. And one of the reasons why I've got these two pictures here is because Vygotsky actually talks about very young children who do not have language as being equivalent to apes. And that is problematic. Another study that I looked at when I was doing the research for this paper actually compared young children's locating skills to that of rats. And they said that these young children failed in comparison to adults. Now, I cannot understand how you can use that language in regards to young children unless you see them as not being human. And that's why it's so important to actually question some of these assumptions and the ways we think about young children's learning, because they actually bring in a whole lot of other assumptions with them, which are not the sorts of things that most people would agree with. So the other one that I wanted to sort of look at between the body and the mind was to do with individual social. So for Piaget, and one of the things with Piaget is he lived a very long life and he wasn't always consistent in what he wrote across that long life. And how he was picked up and used by other researchers were perhaps even more extreme than what Piaget himself would have agreed to. Now, with Vygotsky, we have the other problem. He lived a very short life, he wrote a lot of things, and he wasn't very specific about them. And then again, researchers have picked them up and to some extent been even more extreme with his ideas than he himself perhaps would have agreed to. So although I'm picking on them, it's perhaps more the way that researchers have used them than they themselves have been part of this. So Flavel is a very strong and extreme advocate for Piaget's thinking. And he said that although social and other reinforcements may influence children's curiosity and cognitive explorations to some degree, basically children think and learn because they are built that way. Vygotsky said, human learning presupposes a specific social nature and a process by which children grow into the intellectual life of those around them. What I'm going to try and talk about is that there is a meeting here, a mediation between the individual and the social. I chose this picture of this sandpit here partly because it gives you this idea that yes, we can provide them, this will support their curiosity, but actually in providing them, we've already provided them with an indication of the sorts of things we value in our particular culture. And this artefacts is one of the things that I'm really interested in looking at. So what do we know about toddlers learning about locating? And where is most of the research actually being done? And you can see that I've sort of put it into individual, social, and body and mind. And I won't say that it was a comprehensive review, but it was most of what I could find. And I suspect that there are others out there, but the general sorts of amounts relative to each other isn't going to change. So as you can see, most of them are to do with cognitive individual understandings. So in the mind, done by individuals. There are a few to do with social and mind. A couple here on the body and the individual, and a couple here on the body and social. So, just have to let it do its thing. But there's a point for this particular animation. Francine, who is a Swedish researcher in early childhood, said, when children try to understand the concept of location, they often want to feel altitude. They like to climb up and to jump down, to know how high they dare to climb and can jump. In the individual and mind, this is a very typical sort of understanding. By directing children's attention to spatially relevant aspects of their environment, language highlights patterns that might otherwise go unnoticed. For example, how one block is situated under another is a tower. This spatial language offers a categorical label that emphasises qualitative divisions in what is otherwise continuous space. As such, spatial language might support spatial reasoning ability. So from this perspective, the language comes first. Your reasoning can't come unless you've got the language. So in the mind and the social, Barch and Wellman found that even some 3.5-year-old children could reason about differences in the length of two paths by conceiving of an encompassing spatial array. And one basic feature of this is that intervals of firm, inflexible lengths were used. So when they're thinking about how to actually locate themselves across a large space, they're dividing them up into equal amounts. And as they got older, those spatial distances become more become smaller, they can use smaller ones, but they also become more regular. And that was a feature that even very young children, and that surprised them to an extent. There is, as I say, very few on the social and the body. One of them was done which compared Korean children with Danish children and the languages, and that's where this sort of connection between movement and static abilities to talk about languages. But this was a study where they commented on their own changes. So these young children, toddlers, commented on their own changes of posture or location, such as sitting down, standing up, or climbing up onto chairs or laps. They appealed to adults for help in changing location or to go outside, and they asked to be picked up or carried, and they referred to donning and doffing clothing, and to object manipulations of many kinds. For example, putting things into a bag and taking them out, putting Lego pieces together or pop beads together and taking them apart. Again, we're talking about language. So the way to actually understand, even in this social environment, what young children is doing is to comment on their language and what they can talk about. But this was one of the few naturalistic studies to do with locating. Almost all of these studies have been done in some sort of experimental circumstance, which is not by nature naturalistic. So if we summarise then from what the literature had to say, in these studies, toddlers' bodies provide more than pathways to mental schemata about locating. Their movements support their awareness of locations of themselves and specific objects, and experiences in a range of locations give information which combines the perceptual input in order to solve different kinds of problems. Attributes of the locations provide input about concepts valued by the society, such as the use of spatial terms and interpreting and producing maps. A lot of the research on young children was about this interpreting and producing maps. This was a socially valued artefact which seemed to take over our understandings of what this is, which makes very little sense when you're thinking about toddlers. Cultural artefacts is actually quite important, and I didn't realise until I came to the videos just how important it is, and I'm going to show you two videos and put it into context. But this was a study where it was the Danish children, I think, and the Korean children, but I can't remember now exactly whose study was whose. But what they had to say was, within a single developmental trajectory, young children, we propose, are integrating, sometimes inappropriately, socially normative knowledge of the mechanical use of artefacts with their biologically based capacity for schematising spatial relationships. And it's at least consistent with the data that this cognitive representational integration is occurring from about 9 months of age onwards. So these artefacts are really important. They actually make a huge contribution to the sorts of understandings which are available. Now, the reason why I have put this particular picture in here is because we've got the use of semicircular and circular objects, which, when you are building a large structure like this, is not culturally normal. Because, and the obvious reason is, lots of things can slide off. But young children will explore, and they will find other ways of building with materials in order to make something work, and they will problem solve about it. These children are not just receptive to culturally provided information, they are creative with this culturally provided information. And I think this is something also that we tend to lose in these sorts of discussions about the culture. They're creative as well as receptive of that cultural information. So I'm going to go on and have a look at two videos of toddlers. they're climbing on two different playground equipments. We've got one little child who's walking along this bench here, and then we have another one who is climbing up and over a climbing frame. I've shown this video. We had two Americans, Doug Clements and Julia Sarama, who are very much known in early childhood and mathematics, and they came to a conference in Sweden, and I said, I'm going first with my keynote on this. And they looked at this and they just said, you'd never be able to do this in the United States. It would be seen as so unsafe for these children. It was just not possible. They can't even build a Lego block tower which is higher than their waist because it could be problematic. Yeah. And yet most of the research that we pay attention to in early childhood in mathematics comes out of the States. I mean, what are we thinking when we adopt that sort of understanding? So both of these children struggle with solving the problem of how to get down. They're also involved in asking for and receiving help from adults, but they are in control of this. So, here, no, got to go back, go back, go back, go back. I can do the technology, really I can. So, I'm going to show you these two videos. One of them's quite short, it's only about 45 seconds I think. The other one is about 5 minutes, and I think we will actually wear the time to watch it all the way through. So this is the walking along the bench one. The other thing I have to say that in Scandinavia the children are outside regardless of the weather. I think you have to get to -15 before they're actually brought inside. And the babies, you know, because they have them from 1 year old basically, the babies are slept outside. It's considered to be extremely healthy and they're just rugged up. So it's only until you get to about -15 that they're brought inside. In Bergen, where I live now, you don't get them in this sort of Michelin suit with all the padding in it to keep the cold out. They actually all year wear a wet weather suit, which is a complete all-in-one. And they just get used to being able to get themselves in and get themselves out. But it doesn't matter if it's pouring with rain and, you know, freezing conditions, that is how it is. You're outside. This second video, as I say, is a climbing frame video, and it's a bit longer, but particularly notice how she repeats a lot of her actions and what stops her repeating them and how she actually manages it.
Hello.
She becomes much more confident about getting across the ropes.
Ja, det ser faktiskt så ut. Ja. Ska jag hålla dig lite Betty när du tar dig i... Men vet du vad, du kan inte klättra igenom, du får gå hit här med benen. Kom, vi lyfter upp den igen. Så, och så får du klättra upp igen. Och så ska du in på denna sidan Betty. Så ja. Vet du vad, jag hjälper dig Betty. Så. Och så ska vi in på det andra benet också, så håller jag dig. Så! Så kan du bara klättra ner. Nej, du får inte klättra upp där, Betty. Klättra ner på insidan. Så, ja.
And so she comes down. It's very interesting that before she makes the sort of large cry, she actually turns, checks where the teacher is, and then turns back and then makes the cry. So she's very much making decisions about the sort of help that she wants and how best to get that help. Okay, so these videos were collected as part of a wider sort of research study where we were looking at the sorts of activities which were going on and making some discussions with the teachers about what is mathematics, why might it be mathematics. It wasn't a circumstance where we actually went in asking them to set the children up like that. So for these children, it's a bit like this chicken. They were just doing it because they wanted to do it, not because they were going to be questioned on why they did it or how they did it. But for me particularly, it's almost like you can see their learning happening. They're not verbalizing it, but you cannot tell me that they are not reasoning autonomously about what they are doing. And as soon as you get to that point, you have to go back and start questioning some of the other things which goes with that autonomous reasoning. So what were they learning in this circumstance? They were learning about being in different spatial locations. They were learning about rational autonomy, and they were learning about problem solving. They were definitely solving problems. And consistently across the data that we collected, the children in preschools, early childhood, kindergartens, they are problem solvers. That is how they learn. It's when we get to school and we say, oh, you must do mathematics problem solving, we actually lose them because we think that they're not doing it already. They do it naturally. I just saw today some research study which was in the news about, how important it was to teach problem solving from an early time. We don't have to teach it. It's these children, that's part of their engagement with the world, is to problem solve. They also cope with uncertainty. And a lot of it is about being uncertain and knowing how to move forward. And trying things out and working your way with that. That's part of your reasoning, is to work out what works, what doesn't work, how to get some help with it, how not to get some help with it. Coping with uncertainty. And the cultural artefacts. How much did it actually matter that it was a bench or a climbing frame that they were actually doing this learning on? So being in different spatial locations, specific, static, and in motion, and understanding what it means to be up what it means to get down, what it means to move along, and what it means to be on something. These were all things that both these young children were engaging with. They were also doing it in relationship to things and people. They had to navigate their way along the things, and particularly in the climbing frame, in relationship to the other children who are on that climbing frame, but also in relationship to where the adults were around them. Both of them knew that there were teachers on hand and where they were. So in regards to rational autonomy, the children are making decisions about how to locate themselves in space. It's not something random. They are making decisions about where they want to be and how to get there. On the climbing frame, the child decides where to place her hands and her feet and in what order. And that ordering of that is quite complicated. You can also see that it's a sort of amount of space that she has to move is consistent across. And so she does become more comfortable as she moves across. Towards the end, she actually says, "Titamai," which means look at me. And it is that sort of comes with that confidence of knowing what you're doing. You can move away from actually having to focus really hard on what do you have to do next. You know how to do it, and now you can say, look at me. Both children made decisions about what help that they need and how they should obtain it from the adult. And they were in charge of whether to take it or not to take it. The little girl who's walking along the bench, she first of all asks for help by just... And the teacher pretends she doesn't understand and goes, But then when the child seems a bit more uncertain, the teacher actually gives a hand to it. But it's the child who withdraws from that. She decides, or he decides, and I think it's a she, but the child decides whether or not to take the help and what kind of help that they will gain. Problem solving, child-controlled problem posing and problem solving. The adults are recruited in particular points of that problem solving as part of the problem solving. There's a lot of experimentation within that problem solving, within the limits of feeling safe. The child who got to the end and realised that her hands were not big enough to get onto that big rail and then pull herself out, she realised that she no longer felt safe to negotiate it by herself. That was all part of the problem solving. Coping with uncertainty. Learning about locating is learning about being uncertain. The children have strategies for coping with that uncertainty. And the children are not constrained by the uncertainty, but just negotiate it with adults. And I think this is, again, one of the things that, I would really like us from learning with early childhood to push it into school learning. Because we could actually negotiate with mathematics learning that coping with uncertainty is part of what you do. That mathematics shouldn't be about always knowing how to get the right answer. It should be about negotiating the uncertainty of not knowing how to get the right answer immediately. The cultural artefacts, they're more than just words. The focus that we've had on language has actually, I think, been disruptive for our understanding of what else is going on. The playground equipment affects the type of locating experiences provided. Particularly our built environment, including playground equipment, incorporates spatial attributes that our society values. Straight lines and perpendicular angles. They're not going up a tree in a diagonal. They are just negotiating horizontal and vertical surfaces. And I think that has a lot to explain for the sorts of things which go into school mathematics when we move into geometry and what is put into there. And it actually gives us some thought to think about, well, what other kinds of climbing could occur, and what does that have to say about the words that we use and relating them to these sorts of cultural artefacts? What can we learn? Young children learn without using language for explicit reflection, and language is learned alongside learning the mathematics. It doesn't come first. And particularly for children who don't have the language of instruction or the mainstream language in the schooling, we do not have to wait for them to get the language to deal with the mathematical understandings. They are there. The whole body is involved in learning and reflection. It's not just a head imagination thing. It is the whole body. Feeling uncertain is something which is within the whole body. As a consequence of this, my final point is that mathematics for young children would be better considered as a set of dynamic, fluctuating activities which children learn through problem solving. It's not a body of flat knowledge that you can pour into children. Knowing what shapes are and that a triangle has 3 corners and 3 sides is actually unimportant. It is much better that they have explored what triangles can do that a circle cannot do. What a square can do, what a rectangle can do, that a circle cannot do. It's about the problem solving, and then the knowledge can come with that. But we so often insist on the knowledge first that we lose this connection to the problem solving. And as I say, it's not just about children. This, if I can get myself to it, this came up on my newsfeed today. You can see that originally I was Australian, and so I still look at the Australian news, even though I now live in Norway and have done for some time. But urban exploration, how far would you go for your Instagram photo? And all of the discussion about these young people's exploration of sites which are out of bounds is to do with living with uncertainty and coping and locating yourself in places which have no map for them. And it seems to me that we can actually learn from what toddlers can do and think about learning more generally as a consequence of that. So at that point, I will say thank you very much.
Does anyone have any questions or comments about the Tamsin's talk? Anything it triggers for you in terms of your own work with young children?
Because we couldn't understand the language that was in that video, one thing that I'm always interested in is to know whether or not the teachers are using conceptually rich language as the children are engaging in that activity in order to encourage, you to say, the language to come with the learning. Is that what your PD was about?
Yes, yeah. I mean, what we can see in both these videos is that the teacher's role is somewhat passive. And this has been one of the issues to do with the idea that children learning through play, the adult's role is to watch. And it often means that they sit to the side and don't actually engage with the children, what is happening. And so one of our PD is not to change that, except that there is a possibility to ask some questions about it, to talk about it with the children, still taking the flow from what the child's interests are. It's not embedding something on the top of it, but actually going, okay, so what are these children interested in? If we want to make them mathematically curious, how can we add to this situation by asking sorts of questions which go with that? And that has been one of the issues that we've been working with, of how to actually get the teachers more actively engaged. How can they actually promote some of the sorts of rich imaginative play and the hypothetical thinking sorts of issues which go with this? I showed other videos from our things in South Africa. And if you've been to South Africa, there is a lot of testing there. There is a lot of concern that children don't learn. And I showed them one video of children playing with glass jars. And again, it was a sort of like, you know, how dangerous is that? But the thing that you don't need a lot of very expensive equipment, you can just use everyday things. But one of the things in there was that there was one particular child who couldn't count past 7. And they said, oh, well, shouldn't you be testing them and picking them up? And I said, the teacher is fully aware that this child can't do it. Within this short 10-minute video, you can see she actually sets up a situation where she can ask it twice. But because it's within the play situation, the children can say no. I don't have to answer that. You know, I'm in control because it's play. As soon as the teacher imposes something, it's no longer play. But within that, the teacher has a role of actually offering different points, but also allowing that the children can say no. And we know that that child learnt to count to a lot more because we went back the following year and yes, she was counting a lot more. There was no point in actually doing testing. The teachers knew and they were responsive.
It does, something I noticed as a comment, that it does speak to the skill of the teacher in being able to read the non-verbal as well. And I think when we have settings that are quite busy and the time isn't there for things to slow down, you miss those cues, I think. And because what I saw in both videos was a sense of being tentative with the next step, but taking that step anyway, and the adult being nearby with an awareness that this was part of their learning process. And they didn't need to step in at that point, but allowing that time and allowing children to be tentative with their next step, but at the same time be part of that. So that hands-on experience is really important as well, as opposed to seeing maths as an abstract thing to be talked about, but something that you can live, I guess, as part of your experience as a child.
I think it's also that it was through doing the filming and going back to the teachers that they were more able to see what was potentially mathematical. They were doing a lot of these things themselves, but if you said to them, you know, what mathematics do you do in your preschool, we probably would have got the counting and we probably would have got the shape naming, because the research which was there says that most Swedish preschool teachers, that is what they consider to be mathematics. So there is this role to actually expand and elaborate on what mathematics can be, and then allow it to be connected to other sorts of mathematical curiosities. But it's being a good preschool teacher requires huge skills, many more skills than even being a school teacher, and many more skills than being a doctor. Because when you're a doctor, and I say this all the time, and doctors go, but when you're a doctor, the patient comes into you and they tell you what's wrong, and then you try some medicine out, and if it doesn't work, they come back and you try it again. You know, with these children, you've got this range of children in front of you, and you're having to work out all the time what they're doing and what's the next step to increase their curiosity about the world. And each one is different and each moment is different. And it requires enormous skills and expertise. And however long your education for teacher education is, it's never going to be long enough. You have to develop those skills with practice and with professional development continuously.